Mr. President, as Prime Minister and Minister for External Affairs of my country, I have indeed been very pleased that I had the opportunity of attending this, the 11th annual session of the General Assembly for the first time. I am also pleased to be here for another reason, and that is that I come here fresh from our conference at Delhi of the Prime Ministers of the Colombo countries, whose joint statement issued after the Delhi conference, I find has been before you, has been referred to on various occasions by several speakers. I welcome the opportunity of being able, perhaps where necessary, to explain to you more fully what we feel with regard to some of the important problems that you have been called upon to deal with at this time. I wish, Mr. President, at the outset to offer you, on behalf of the Ceylon delegation, our congratulations on your election to that high office. I have no doubt that your long devotion to the ideals and the causes which this great organization represents, and the recognition by delegates of your high qualities of devotion, of ability and tact, have been responsible for your election to that high office. Personally, I have an especial pleasure in your election, because your country is in the same region as ours, and between my country and yours there have been close and friendly cultural and other bonds for many centuries in the past. My country, together with many others, languished in the anterooms of this organization for many years before, by a signal stroke of statesmanship last year, 16 countries were admitted to membership of the United Nations. I regret that still there are countries who are awaiting admission, countries whose claims for such admission appear to many of us to be unquestioned, and whose admission will undoubtedly make more fully representative the membership of this great world organization for peace. I hope that before long their claims will receive the consideration which is their due. Amongst them, I wish to mention in particular such countries as the People's Republic of China and Japan. I have had the opportunity of reading with great interest the annual report of the Secretary General. There are some matters of importance where appreciable success has been achieved in the year under review. Certain others where valuable progress has been made. And in all, I suppose it might be said, a certain degree of continuous activity appears to have been maintained. I should like to take this opportunity, if it is not out of place, to congratulate the Secretary General on the able, efficient, and devoted manner in which he has been and is performing his function. Particularly during recent events, the Secretary General, as the Chief Executive Officer of the United Nations, in carrying out in the letter as well as the spirit the decisions of the United Nations, has greatly enhanced the reputation and prestige of the United Nations. I congratulate him, and I congratulate ourselves on possessing an officer of such preeminent and distinguished quality. But I suppose it is true that the normal activities of the United Nations have been overshadowed by certain recent happenings subsequent to the period covered by the annual report of the Secretary General. I refer to happenings in Egypt and in Hungary. These events have provided, on the one hand, a crucial test for the United Nations, and on the other hand, a great opportunity. I should like to say that it is my opinion that the United Nations has emerged out of these crises with its reputation and prestige enhanced. I have heard, no doubt, many people here criticism of the United Nations on the ground that it is slow to act, that when it does act, it cannot act effectively, that it sometimes tends to lose itself in diffuse thinking and still more diffuse decisions. Those who criticize the United Nations should bear in mind that in the circumstances, in all the circumstances of the case, the United Nations has proved as successful, sometimes even more successful than what one might have realistically expected. The United Nations is not a super state possessed of forces, armed forces, capable of asserting its authority even over powerful members or non-members who may act contrary to the purposes of the United Nations. It can and does bring to bear a certain collective moral force of the world, which, although it may not be effective, expeditiously effective in all cases, commands in certain cases, as it has done in the past, success, and in certain others at least, a very salutary restraining influence. I wish naturally to say a few words on these two questions that are exercising our minds today, S.W.R.D and Hungary. I do not propose to delay you with a reiteration of the whole history that has led up to these tragic happenings. In the case of Suez, I briefly wished to recount certain facts that are important to the background of our thinking in this matter. The President of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal Company. I do not find in any quarter a disposition seriously to question his right to do so, though the manner in which it was done, the time in which it was done, may be considered inexpedient by some, incorrect by others. The basic fact of his right to do so has not been questioned. If that is correct, I consider that it follows as a corollary to the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company that the power of operation of the canal should also vest in Egypt. But that is not the whole story. There are important international interests in the Suez Canal that also need to be safeguarded. We are all agreed on that. Interests that I feel could adequately have been safeguarded by, while recognizing the right of nationalization and the right of control following thereon, the entering into of a convention on somewhat similar lines to the Constantinople Convention of 1888, but with further provisions, if you needed, to provide for some consultative or advisory committee whose advice Egypt would have been compelled to seek in dealing with important matters of an operational nature. If there was a disagreement between the two, surely some machinery for arbitration in such instances could have been devised. That would have been the most hopeful method of procedure in order to obtain agreement while satisfying what both sides claim to be certain fundamental needs. But the moment that a majority of the countries assembled at the London Conference decided on international control of the operation of the canal, fundamental difficulties immediately arose. The mission led by the Prime Minister of Australia to Egypt for discussions with Colonel Nazar were bound in the circumstances to prove a failure. I cannot believe that anyone seriously contemplated that there could be otherwise. Thereafter, quite rightly, the powers more immediately concerned referred this issue to the Security Council of the United Nations. And an agreement on certain principles known as the Six Principles by England, France, and Egypt were unanimously endorsed by the Security Council. What we fail to understand is this: why were not negotiations proceeded with on the basis of those agreed six principles to see how far agreement could be reached? I have yet failed to understand why either one side concerned or the other or both, or failing that, the good officers of the United Nations were not requisitioned in order to carry on those negotiations. The matter was referred to the United Nations, the Security Council, in order to pursue the method of negotiation as against that of force, which had been earlier threatened. It had reached a point when those negotiations could take place on an agreed basis for discussion. Why did they not take place? Why was it necessary for the intrusion before further discussion of this unfortunate resort to force? Israel made an attack on Egyptian territory. Why, pray? Because she had grievances in the past? Because she feared Egypt's aggression or attacks in the future? Why was this particular moment chosen? I never choose to condemn anyone until condemnation is based on proof. But is it not somewhat difficult to escape some belief that the Egyptian action followed by that of the Anglo-French forces were not altogether unconnected with each other? That Egypt at the very least may have thought, and in a moment of inspiration, that it was a good moment for her to move, and that an attack by her then would produce action on the part of the British and the French, which would in fact amount to a support of that. However, as I say, I prefer not to attach motives to anybody. I prefer, until something is definitely proved, not to condemn anyone. Mistake to do so. But it does seem to me at least a rather strange coincidence that those events in that order should have so taken place. A very unfortunate coincidence. I'm glad that the United Nations immediately dealt with the matter, arrived at certain decisions, and that those decisions are now in the process of implementation. May I say here that I appreciate very much the fact that even in principle, England, France, and Israel have accepted the decisions of the United Nations for a ceasefire and for a withdrawal. I only hope that very quickly those steps will materialize. I must tell you that it is my view and the view of my other colleagues, the Asian Prime Ministers, that we still think the position is extremely delicate and dangerous. We do not feel that there is any occasion for undue complacence. I am glad that substantially a ceasefire has taken place, but the withdrawal of the forces has not yet taken place. A United Nations police force is already in the process of being established in Egypt in order to carry out the decisions of the United Nations in supervising a withdrawal of those forces. I say this, and I say it with all seriousness, that as long as foreign troops, be they Israeli, British or French, continue on Egyptian territory, the position is one that is fraught with the greatest danger and one that may bring about results leading to a third world war. I wish to say that those forces must be withdrawn now without any delay. I wish to say that I think it would be very unwise to follow some principle of a phased withdrawal, or withdrawing those forces in numbers according to the UN forces, in numbers that go there. 100 UN troops going into Egypt, 100 being withdrawn. 200 going in, 200 being withdrawn, and so on. There can be no greater mistake than that. That the moment that even a token UN force is established on Egyptian territory, it would be sufficient occasion in the interests of us all for Israeli forces to be withdrawn behind the armistice lines and the British and French forces to be withdrawn from Egyptian territory. I cannot conceive that either Egypt or Israel will make an assault upon forces of the United Nations. I just don't believe it. So that it is really not required for a large force in the UN to be present before those forces are withdrawn. The first and the most vital thing is a withdrawal of forces from Egyptian territory now, as early as possible. If that does not happen, under even the guise of volunteers, let us say, volunteers within inverted commas, we know what volunteers mean. If other countries, in order to secure the observance of the decisions of the United Nations, take steps, I fear the results may be very far-reaching, and all our efforts so far be swept away in a moment. There is another important thing, of course, the early clearing of the Suez Canal. That is very important to all of us, particularly for us. Most of our trade, the most of trade of Ceylon, 75% of it, incoming, outgoing, pass through the Suez Canal. I take it, not only for us, but for so many other countries, Western as well as Asian, it is important that the Suez Canal be cleared as early as possible. I feel it should be done under the auspices of the United Nations. There is one point regarding that matter, whether the clearing of the canal should start at once, in full force, prior to any substantial withdrawal of foreign forces on Egyptian territory, or should be subsequent to it. I hope that such quibbles will not stand in the way, in practice, of doing the thing that is necessary. I personally feel that a substantial withdrawal of foreign forces from Egyptian territory at once would greatly facilitate the further task of clearing of the Suez Canal. I am quite sure that Egypt, I hope at least that Egypt will not object to the United Nations under its flag using whatever material and tackle is rather specialized tackle required for this purpose that is available, whatever source it happens to come from, in order to clear the Suez Canal. The withdrawal of the foreign forces from Egypt immediately, the very quick clearing of the Suez Canal, must then be followed by negotiations regarding the Suez Canal on the basis of those 6 principles which presumably still stand. Those are the steps that are necessary to be taken once. Those are the steps which I hope the United Nations will try to achieve in the course of its deliberations in the days to come. With regard to the general settlement of the affairs, the rather complicated and complex affairs of Western Asia, it's another matter. I sincerely hope that sometime those troubles can be settled, particularly those between Israel and her Arab neighbors. I trust when the bitterness of these incidents have somewhat died down, it will be possible for those primarily concerned at least to have a talk about an honorable settlement of those differences. But I hope that that longer-term process will not be mixed up with the immediate needs that have arisen today out of this situation. I am not so optimistic as to believe that those differences can be settled at an early date. I don't for one moment believe so. First things first. And let us deal with these first problems which I mentioned, which are essential to prevent the possibility, believe me, the probability of a serious worsening of a situation which some may feel superficially is now assuaged. Is not so. I wish to say a few words about Hungary. There seems to be a feeling in the minds of some people that some of our countries were indifferent or even lukewarm about certain happenings in Hungary. I wish strongly to repudiate this charge. What happened? It will interest you to know when the very first resolution regarding Hungary, this Hungarian episode, was introduced here, it was done in such a desperate hurry. The matter brought up to the Security Council, with the General Assembly, a vote taken within a few hours. But some of us had no opportunity to bring our minds to it. I remember I was fast asleep in Colombo when an urgent cablegram from our permanent representative here was received by me about 11 o'clock at night, asking for instructions, saying that a vote was going to be taken, and so on. I had not all the facts or data before me. I could not even get my office open in order to get at such papers as were available in my office at that hour of the night. We are rather respectable, Mr. President, in Colombo. We go to bed fairly early, and we remain there, you know, till the morning. Well, what could I do? I instructed my permanent secretary to send off immediately a cablegram to our representative here, making certain general suggestions and asking him to consult others, the group with which we are associated, in taking action. We abstained from voting. That's how that abstention came. Is it really, Mr. President, not possible, when this World Assembly discusses subjects of paramount importance, to give a certain reasonable measure of time for consideration and consultation before important decisions are arrived at? It seems to me a great pity if if the urgency of the situation, if I may so call it, demand that type of action in that hurried manner. That's what happened. I believe it was the case in some other Asian countries too. They had just not time to issue instructions to their representatives or even consider the matter. There seemed to be such a desperate haste to get something through, a desperate haste which I fail to understand. I do not think that the lapse of a few hours, 12 hours, would have made such an overwhelming difference to the case. With regard to your second resolution on Hungary that was moved here, it was like the proverbial curate say, good in parts and bad in parts. We agreed with the request that Russian troops be withdrawn from Budapest and from Hungary without any delay. We could not quite agree with that portion of the resolution that dealt with or requested a free elections to be held in Hungary under the vigilant eye of UN observers. You will notice what we did, what we said at Delhi. What we said there was the Russian troops should be withdrawn and that Hungary will be left free to work out our own destiny. Why should we dictate to any country that they should have elections as we want them to have them? Surely, whether it is a Russian dictatorship in Hungary, Anglo-French dictatorship in Egypt, or even the dictatorship of the United Nations, which militates against the sovereignty of a country, I think that they are all perhaps equally unwise and undesirable. What were we to do with a resolution, part of which we agreed with and part we disagreed with? I asked my representative here to secure, if possible, a separate vote on the separate parts. When the resolution as a whole was put, the only logical course we followed. We abstained from vote, having expressed our views quite clearly and openly from the first. Then your last resolution, the resolution of Cuba, which I had the privilege of listening to, the debate on that here yesterday, was passed by a majority vote. Another resolution introduced by India, Ceylon, Indonesia, was also passed, which I leave to the ingenuity of the Secretary General to reconcile the two decisions. However, I feel that the resolution introduced by us was a more reasonable and logical one than certain aspects of the wording of the other resolution. You have also passed a resolution for relief to Hungary. We decided to recommend that to others and do it ourselves at the Delhi conference, and we are doing it. Our governments are doing it. My government has voted probably a few days ago. We are a poor country, but what we could give towards relief in Hungary as well as in Egypt. Budapest needs relief. Port side does not, doesn't. They all need relief. To my mind, if I may be forgiven for using that phrase, I don't say disparagingly of anyone. The thug or the rowdy who deals a man one blow, the thug and the rowdy who deals a man two blows. There is no fundamental difference between the two, is there? Fundamentally, both are worthy of condemnation. That was our attitude regarding Egypt and Hungary. But let us remember this. Mere dialectics are not sufficient in dealing with these situations. Let us learn the lessons which Egypt and Hungary teach us. Let us deal with the immediate problems necessary, and let us gear up world organization, if we can, to prevent the recurrence of such incidents in the future. That seems to be the wise course to follow. We gain nothing by undue mutual recriminations and revilings. I, as a Buddhist, remember the story of the Buddha. The answer he gave to an opponent who came before him and abused him for hours. This is what he told him. He told him, listened to him patiently and said, "My dear friend, if you invite guests to a banquet and the guests do not come, what do you do to the food that's prepared?" Oh, he said, "Well, I and my family will consume the food if the guests don't arrive." So he told the man who abused him, "You have offered me your abuse. I am not receiving. You can take it yourself." Revilings and recriminations, mutually wounding each other's feelings by sharp retorts and angry words, won't help us over much. But there are certain things to which we cannot be blind. What have we to do now? I have suggested the immediate steps to be taken in Egypt. And the immediate steps, as you have decided, indeed, that should be and must be taken in Hungary. I would appeal to the government of Hungary not to oppose the recommendation of this assembly that some impartial observers should go there in order to observe the situation and to discover the truth or otherwise of charges that have been made on one side and equally vehemently repudiated on the other. I do appeal that the step be taken. And I appeal to the British, French and Israelis to withdraw their troops, indeed they have agreed to do, now without any delay. In that way, the good name of those countries, as well as perhaps world peace, will best be safeguarded. Now, there is a further significance, of course, in these happenings. I draw your attention particularly to that. We of Asia, who have suffered under imperialist colonial rule for many centuries, are naturally extremely sensitive to anything approaching a resurgence of the spirit of imperialism and colonialism. We do see, I hope we are wrong, but we feel strongly that the happenings in Egypt, perhaps the echo of those happenings in Hungary, are a manifestation, once again, of a certain resurgence of the spirit of colonialism, the desire of a strong power in order to get its objects, achieve its ends, to impose its will even by force on a weak power. Are you surprised that we lay greater emphasis on Egypt than on Hungary? Far more dangers are inherent for the world in the Egyptian position. In Hungary, we deplore both, of course. But this assembly very right came to the conclusion that the problem of Egypt was a more urgent and serious one than that of Hungary, though both are to be condemned and deplored alike. You will see, therefore, the importance of these happenings and how strongly many of us, vast majority of this assembly, feel on these matters. It is not late, not too late even now, to put things right. It's not too late yet to remedy this situation, though I greatly fear that the bitterness created by these incidents will not be easily forgotten. will not be easily forgiven. But let us hope that the preservation of peace now, of believing that the great powers of the world were united in upholding peace and decency in dealings between man and man, nation and nation. We believe that this great assembly provided the opportunity for all, great and small, to unite in achieving that object. But when great powers, permanent members of the Security Council, themselves act in a way that has brought on their heads the condemnation of this assembly, cannot it be realized how gravely that confidence is shattered, particularly in the minds of those of us who are small and weak, who hoped that in this new world we would be able, without brigandage, national law, international brigandage and piracy, be able to work out our destinies and advance towards peace and happiness. All those are the results of these recent happenings. I have dealt with the two important problems today of Egypt and Hungary, the position as I see it, the steps that should be taken immediately, and also perhaps in the not too distant future. I wish to say a few words finally about Asia. There is some misunderstanding of the position of some of our Asian countries. I wish to explain the position to you fairly. Many of our countries in Asia, have re-emerged into freedom after 300, 400 years of colonial imperialist rule. At this epoch of newly gained freedom, we find ourselves faced with a dual problem, a problem within a problem. First, the problem of converting a colonial society, politically, socially, and economically, into a free society. And the problem of effecting that conversion against a background of changing world conditions. The world itself is in a state of change and flux today. The world is going through one of those rare occasions. They have happened at certain intervals of a changeover from one society to another, from one civilization to another. We are living today, in fact, in a period of transition between two civilizations, the old and the new. At a period like this, all kinds of conflicts arise. Ideological, national, economic, political, every kind of conflict. Done so in the past. In the past, they were settled by some nice little war here or there. Today, we cannot afford the luxury of war, but we all know what it means. So the task for us today is a far more difficult one than ever faced mankind in the future, to effect this transition to some form of stable human society, and to do it amid a welter of conflict, with reasonable peace, with the avoidance of conflict that bursts out into war. For war is unthinkable today. It is an age when we have to live and let live. when we cannot afford to hate each other so much that we are prepared to sacrifice all mankind in the name of this ism or some other ism. We cannot afford to do that today. We have within, of course, honor and those principles which we hold dear, to live and let live. That is the philosophy behind the doctrine of coexistence. We nation, we do not hate anybody. We like to be friends with all. We have to build up a new society for ourselves, as I told you, that suits best the genius of our country. We like to get something, some ideas, some principles from this side, some ideas from the other, until and unless a coherent form of society is built up that suits our own people in the context of the changing world of today. That is why we do not range ourselves on the side of this power bloc or that power bloc. That is the philosophy of neutralism. It is not something dishonest. It is not sitting on the fence to see if we can get the best of both worlds. It is a position that is inexorably thrust upon us by the circumstances of the case. Believe me, it is a position that will be of great help in the world situation today, for we do provide a bridge over the gulf between the two opposing sections. We are supposed to be uncommitted. I strongly object to that word, uncommitted. We are committed up to the hilt, believe me. We are committed to preserve decency of dealing between nations. We are committed to the cause of justice and freedom as much as anyone else. That briefly is our position. I trust it will not be superficially misunderstood. Mr. President, sometimes the feeling comes over me, as I'm sure it does over many of us, that the fight is not worthwhile, that there is in fact no hope for mankind to escape the perplexities, problems, conflicts, hatreds, enmities that seem to be arising all about. But sometimes when I feel that, I'm fortified by the thought that through the dark fabric of human history, there passes one golden thread of unfailing strength and firmness, the unconquered, unconquerable spirit of man. It has manifested itself through the ages in various diverse different ways. First of all, the unconquerable spirit of man fighting for bare survival and existence. Later, for various causes, national may be, cause of justice, the cause of freedom, the pursuit of truth on the part of the great religious leaders. Through the ages, it's manifested. Today it is needed in the cause of human friendship and of peace. What is peace? Peace is not merely a negative thing. The absence of one set of people trying to kill another set of people. No doubt the prevention of war is a necessary factor in peace. But peace, believe me, is something much more positive than that. For peace in its true sense means human understanding, human friendship and cooperation, out of which indeed peace in its true form alone can arise. I look upon the United Nations as the one machine available to mankind today, through which it can express this unconquerable spirit of man in its efforts to achieve that peace, friendship, and collaboration which is, I hope, the object of us all. Mr. President, my country is a small one, a weak one, a poor one. But I venture to think that today, particularly in an organization like this, the service that a country can render, that a member can render, is not to be measured alone by the size of the country, its population, its power, or its strength. This is an organization which expresses itself most effectively by bringing to bear a certain moral force, the collective moral force and decency of human beings. That is a task in which the weak as well as the strong can render a useful service. And I give you the assurance on behalf of my country that as far as we are concerned, every endeavor that we can make in all sincerity to assist in the achievement of those noble ideals for which this organization stands will always be forthcoming in the fullest measure. Mr. President, I thank you and my fellow delegates for the extreme patience, courtesy, and kindness with which you have listened to me.